Hey y'all, it is Brittany here, aka Oakla Soda Gal. And as I promised on my social feeds last night, I am making a video today digging into some recent data that was just released the other day by the Public Religion Research Institute. So they came up with some polling questions to gauge Americans' receptiveness or adherence to Christian nationalist ideas. And so they designed this around, there were kind of five questions that it's really designed around to help create a scale of how much people agree or disagree with various fundamental precepts of Christian nationalism. So that's what I'm digging into today, and I want to help explain it because, I think a lot of folks might see some of these statistics in in posts or something that it's really hard in a Threads post or in a Facebook post to give the kind of detail and nuance to help you understand exactly what those numbers are saying. And so rather than try to, make one little post about it, I decided it might be easier to go through some of it with you and help explain, from my perspective as someone who was trained in sociology before going to law school and who's been in political consulting as part of my career over the last 20 years, to just kind of help you explain how I look at data, how I think about it, how to analyze it, so that it can make sense and be more useful to you moving forward. So, without further ado, I am going to bring up a slideshow from the PRRI website that they just released on their website the other day, and I'm going to go through some things with you. I also did some math before this to take those percentages and put some hard numbers to them, and I'll show you some of that as well. So first off, let me share my screen here, and let's go to the slideshow. And so this is the survey methodology for the survey that PRRI did. And so this was a poll that was conducted between the end of February last year and the beginning of December last year. So this was over a period of several months to gather the biggest sample possible. And you see here, they had 20,771 adults who were part of the Ipsos Knowledge Panel, and then another 1,340 uh, at the state level opt-in. So we got a total sample of around 22,000 adults. To put that in perspective, a lot of the political polling you see, like on presidential races, that will have a margin of error of like ±3 to ±5%. A lot of those polls are just of like 1,500 to 2,000 people. And so they're a much smaller sample size, and so they have a wider margin of error. Because this has such a large sample size, that margin of error is listed as being around plus or minus 0.87 percentage points. So these numbers should be pretty accurate statistically speaking. Obviously, 22,000 isn't 330 million, but when properly weighted and properly, conducted and making sure you have representative groups that are, equal to the percentage of those folks in the population at large, it can still be very valuable and give you good information. So I wanted to put that out there first. So this is a very, very meaningful polling because it has a very small margin of error. And to do this measurement, they came up with five statements here. And in these statements, people could agree with any of these or all of them if they wanted to. So, and each of these folks who was polled was given the options agree completely, somewhat agree, don't know, or neutral. somewhat disagree, or completely disagree. So the five statements here, you see the God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. Only 23% of respondents agreed with that statement. The US government should declare America a Christian nation. 30% agreed with that. So there's, 30% of Americans believe America should be a quote unquote Christian nation. 33% agreed with being Christian is an important part of being truly American. 39% agreed with the statement, if the US moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. Now, this one's a little more vague, and this final one is even more vague. US laws should be based on Christian values. This one I'm a little bit critical of because while, if it's combined with some of the other responses as being agreed with, it might be more telling. But I could also see progressive Christians who would agree with that because they believe the government should help the needy and have a safety net and provide for the poor. Because those are Christian values, and somebody could have answered this earnestly in agreement and be, completely on the opposite side of Christian nationalism. So a critique right out of the gate here off of one of these, questions that was posed. Um, but you can see here, none of these has over 50% support. So hopeful point number one is the majority of Americans do not agree with pretty much any precept of Christian nationalism. So if you're like me and you believe the Constitution means what it says and that church and state are separate things and aren't to be intertwined, as it says in the Constitution, then be heartened to know that the vast majority of us do agree with that. So, wanted to go over that first and foremost. Now, what they did with these questions is then they created a scale to create four distinct groups. And adherents are people who overwhelmingly or completely agreed with like all five of those precepts. So the more you agreed with all five of them, you were given a score based on your responses to all five. People who agreed basically with three-quarters or more of those statements are put into the adherence category. So these are people who adhere to Christian nationalism fundamentally. The next group is called sympathizers. These are people who, somewhat or completely agreed with most of those statements, but not quite to the degree that the adherents do. So these are folks who, they might lean towards some Christian nationalist ideas, but they're not fully on board with all of it. Maybe they agreed with all of it except for declaring the US a Christian nation or something. So they're somewhat sympathetic to Christian nationalism, but they're not fully bought in. Then we had skeptics, and these are people who mostly disagreed. Um, and again, this is one that I think, some folks might have been put in the skeptic category based on that final response regarding, our laws should be based in Christian values, because they may have meant it from a progressive point of view of, well, yeah, we should help the poor and, have safety nets. So skeptics, I'm a little bit not sure how perfect that category is. But then we also have rejectors. And rejectors are the people who completely disagreed with all five questions. That would have been, I might have fallen into the skeptic category because I might have answered that final question about based in some Christian foundation. I might have said somewhat disagree rather than completely disagree. So if you completely disagreed with all five, though, you were a rejecter. So those are our four groups: adherents, sympathizers, skeptics, rejectors. And so once we figure out who those groups are, now we can figure out, well, how many people are in each group. And this gets really important here. As you can see, the vast majority, 37 plus 27, are either skeptics or rejectors. So that's 64% of Americans are either skeptical or reject Christian nationalist ideals. So two out of three of us. So there's only one in three that, about 32% here that are listed as either sympathizers or adherents, and only 11% that are actually listed as adherents. So that's important to know. We the folks who, are against Christian nationalism, we're the vast majority. So, if you're afraid that calling out Christian nationalism is going to turn people off, if you're a political candidate out there, you should take heart and know that you can call out Christian nationalism without being seen as necessarily being anti-Christian or anti-religion. Now, before we get into the state level stuff, I do want to get into those hard numbers I talked about. Because while the percentages are great and they do, show some value here, I think, looking at some hard numbers is helpful. So I'm going to go over to this, going back to those statements on the Christian nationalism scale. So there's 23% who believe that God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. So the most fundamentalist Christian nationalist possible. There are that 23% of Americans, based on a 2025 population estimate of 341 million, means that there are about 78.43 million Americans who believe that God has called them to exercise dominion over all of society. So while it's only 23%, that is a large, large number of people. That's like two California's worth of people who agree with that. That's a lot of people. Um, Now, the flip side of that, though, is there are also, 77% who don't agree with that. And that means there are 262.5 million of us who would disagree with that. So there are vastly more of us than there are of those folks. So, but, I think putting hard numbers to it helps you take in the real problem we have here, and that, almost 80 million people agree with that, but 262 million or so don't. The other one I really wanted to break down in here was the Christian foundations. If we move away from them, we won't have a country anymore. So these are folks who are susceptible to that messaging, that these others are coming in and forcing their religions on us and taking away our culture. People susceptible to that. There's 133 million almost that are susceptible to that messaging. And then the flip side of that, though, is that, there are 208 million. Oh, wait, my screen sharing is paused. Why? Do. Okay. I may have not shown you those numbers. Um, Go back here. Looks like I needed to share the different pages here. Do do do. So the Christian Dominion, here's that number. I did the math with the calculator there so you can see. I did the math for all of those that I cited a moment ago. Not going to go over them all again. I apologize for being bad at technology here. Um, but yeah, so that's where we're at. Um, lot millions of people who are in on Christian nationalism and millions of people who are not. Vast majority of us are not. Now, I did want to get back into the rest of the presentation that we had here. So I'll go through here. There was some interesting data here as well among states. Um, it's really interesting for my friends in Oklahoma. You have a much bigger issue in that, adding up adherents and sympathizers, you have 49% of Oklahomans are either fully on board or sympathetic to Christian nationalism. That means there's still a 51% majority in Oklahoma that doesn't, so it's a slight majority. And with a plus or minus of 1%, it may be closer to 50-50. So they were one of the higher states, though. Meanwhile, Minnesota, where I'm currently living, only 28% are either adherent or sympathetic to Christian nationalism. And really, almost the entire West is really not susceptible to a lot of Christian nationalism. Utah was an interesting one. Um, Mormons had like a 50% adherence or sympathy to Christian nationalism, but only 31% of all of Utah does. So it seems like while there's a high likelihood of taking that in for Mormons generally, the state as a whole, there's enough non-Mormons there that only 31% end up being in the pro-Christian nationalism category. Texas was another interesting one. Only 38% are in on Christian nationalism, kind of low for a southern state. As you see, Arkansas is a majority, West Virginia is a majority, and Mississippi is a majority. So those are states with very, very high rates of Christian nationalism. Minnesota and Illinois are somewhat outliers in the Midwest. Most of the Midwest is over 30, except for Minnesota and Illinois. So that stood out to me. And then getting into some other questions, digging in on issues. Um, there's a couple things that stood out to me. Support by media trust. Um, people who get their news from newspapers just not at all sympathetic to Christian nationalism. Look at that. 46% are skeptics and 37% are rejectors. So people who still get their news from newspapers tend to be the least receptive to Christian nationalism. I was actually surprised mainstream news, a pretty solid chunk, still 72% that were skeptics or rejectors of Christian nationalism. So it seems like, mainstream news not doing too terrible. And then as you go into, further and further broken up spaces, you get into far right news, stuff that's like Newsmax, even further right than Fox News. Then you get into where there's a vast majority there that are adherents to Christian nationalism. I thought Fox News was interesting in that it's somewhat close. It's 55-45, basically. So, there's still 45% almost of Fox News viewers who aren't really into Christian nationalism. So that's interesting. Um, it, the newspapers, though, it seems like newspaper readers are some of the best informed folks out there. This was also interesting. I thought it was like around 11% of Hindu Americans are in favor of Christian nationalism. They're either adherents or sympathizers. That kind of caught me off guard. How would Hindus be into this? Jewish Americans, and also 11% that are into Christian nationalism. Um, but unaffiliated, only 10%. And, it does look like Jewish Americans and unaffiliated Americans are the least receptive to Christian nationalism that are skeptics or rejectors. And then I wanted to go to how people feel about immigration. Um, where was it here? Here we go. The support for the Great Replacement theory. This was actually very hopeful to me. And as my cat comes in to bug me, come here, Azul. Come here, bud. All right. So, this was really interesting to me. We had, even among adherents to Christian nationalism, so these were the group that almost completely agreed with all five of those base level Christian nationalism test questions. There are a 31% of Christian nationalist adherents who disagree that immigrants are invading our country and replacing our cultural and ethnic background. So that means this ICE ethnic cleansing campaign that's going on out there on behalf of MAGA right now. There's a full third of Christian nationalists who don't even buy that rhetoric. So I found that to be a really hopeful thing, and it tells me that, candidates around the country should be vocal about the immigration issue and vocally pushing back on the immigrants or invading us and replacing us, because you might even be getting through to that one third of people who are Christian nationalists who aren't going to reject you out of hand for that rhetoric. So, to me, this is a really hopeful sign. And it tells me that, progressive candidates need to really dig in and push back on what is happening with ICE and with these concentration camp warehouses that are being set up around the country. This is a moment where we can share our values and humanity with even people who are Christian nationalists, that 31% are not buying this rhetoric. And then if you look at the skeptics and rejectors, 68% of skeptics of Christian nationalism are disagree with that immigrants are invading our country and replacing us. And a full 91% of rejectors of Christian nationalism, which, that means, 91% of that 27% of the country, they reject this kind of language as a whole. It also tells me that immigrants are invading and replacing us. It kind of cuts across some weird boundaries, and it's not easy to just glom on to Christian nationalism. And I think that that's reflected in president slash dictator slash wannabe dictator slash memory home patient Donald Trump. His approval ratings are, continuing to go down, especially on this immigration enforcement, because this cuts across so many groups that people just, outside of the strictest adherents, to Christian nationalism, which remember that was only 11% of the country. So one third of that 11% isn't even buying that. So, their group is getting smaller and smaller. It's still millions of people, but it is not the vast majority of us. And so these numbers definitely tell me that progressives need to keep pushing. Don't stop on this issue. Don't be afraid to be out there and pushing back against ICE. You are going to find receptive audiences even among people who are sympathetic or adherent to Christian nationalism. The sympathetic group, 47% don't agree that immigrants are invading and replacing us. So this is fertile ground to work with. Speak your values, stand for your values, and we can stop, this massive abusive system that's being set up right now with our taxpayer money and under our name, in our names as a country. We can stop this. Um, so those are a few of the things I really wanted to just dig into and go over today in a little more depth than I could in just like a Facebook post or a Threads thread. I wanted you to get some real understanding of the data and how I'm analyzing it. And so I hope this was helpful. Leave comments or, comment with me on Threads or on Facebook and talk to me about your questions or whatever other questions you have about this data. You can find this same slideshow at the Public Religion Research Institute website. It's there for anybody to look at, so it's nothing special. So go check it out. Feel free to dig through there. And if you want me to do another follow-up answering some of your questions, I'd be happy to do that. Subscribe to my channel on YouTube if you can. I'm Okla Soda Gal on YouTube and on Threads. I'm occasionally on Blue Sky, but I'll admit I'm rarely there. I don't get much engagement there, and it's not really my favorite app to hang out on. But I will occasionally be there and checking in. So if that's where you're at, leave me a question. Just don't be surprised if it takes me a couple days to get to it because I don't necessarily check it every day. Anyway, hope this was helpful to you. It definitely was illuminating to me. And I'll be back with you to answer your questions at a later date. All right. Thank you all. Have a good one. Peace.